So I'm pretty sure all of you at least once have heard in your lives, or if not a million times, how our parents or our grandparents or just random strangers in general that are adults like to say how our generation are very entitled, lazy, spoiled, irresponsible, and how we complain about having to do chores all the time, and how these days parents find it hard to say no to their children because children think that they should get everything, and parents eventually give in, as stated in Newsweek. And this is probably why kids are so spoiled, but I'm not going to bash parents because that's not what this is about. Basically, it's about this generation Y, or millennials as we've come to call it so often. They're being described as greedy, self-absorbed, wasteful, and just outright irresponsible, as said by The Guardian. This generation tends to be about in the 1965 and 1995 range, and I've seen many different sources where the gap kind of changes. Like, for example, in this graph, it's not exactly correct, but it was the only one I could find that was simple and didn't have so much information that it would be overwhelming, where it states that millennials start in 1982 and end in 2004. And we're often lumped with millennials this way because of the misconceptions that people have, that just because our age groups that we are 18 years old or younger are millennials because of the attitudes that people have towards us. But as stated in The Atlantic, where this graph is from, they think millennials are somewhere in this range, and then there's the to-be-determined generation, which is actually called Generation Z, as I have realized. And I didn't realize beforehand that we are actually Generation Z, because Generation Z is classified in beginning in 1996. And the reason it's classified like this, where Elizabeth Patton from the Financial Times says that if you don't remember 9/11 actually happening, then you're basically a Generation Z, because that's where the tipping point was for Generation Z, that 9/11 was basically the start of our generation in a way. And it's also been called the spoiled generation, the anxious generation, the most overconfident and financially irresponsible generation, as well as many others, as stated by Wagner of Nexshark, McRae from Daily Mail, and Makowitz from the NY Post. McRae states that parents basically created this generation, that they bred a spoiled generation of children that thinks grown-ups must earn respect from them before we give respect to the grown-ups, which is not necessarily true, because in order to get respect, you have to give it first, as we all know. And this also comes into, in tune with the fact that we don't want to do chores because physical labor apparently is not something we want to do, that we think we're so entitled that we shouldn't have to do them, pretty much. And Makowitz said that 80% of this generation has very high anxiety, which considers us very delicate and tender, and that you can't say anything bad to us or we get offended immediately or we start to break down and cry. And it's evident a lot in social media or in the attitudes that we have, where a lot of posts where you say that I can't even, or I just can't, things like that sort. I mean, how many times have you guys seen posts that look like this on the internet, where it seems like everything's going wrong and our world is falling apart, and it's basically just our generation that has to do with this. Wagner's view, however, is a little bit more on the negative side, in the fact that he thinks we're very overconfident and financially irresponsible, and which is contrary to the fact that people think that we're very delicate. And in a study that he did, he stated that 61% of millennials believe that they are less financially irresponsible than their parents, which is not necessarily true, because in these studies, even though 59% of millennials described their generation as self-absorbed, 49% said they were wasteful, 43% said that they were greedy, a lot of these statistics have to do with the fact that we're just very self-conscious, and we don't think that we are as successful as our parents are, even though we aren't even in the workforce yet technically, because we're all still in college. And so these statistics actually say that I don't have them written up here, but actually roughly about 50% of millennials are actually financially responsible because of this worry that we aren't. And we're putting ourselves down, which is not a very good thing. Sorry. It's not a very good thing, and it's not something to be proud of, in my opinion. And I would think most of you agree that putting ourselves down and giving us this negative stereotype is not something that we should be doing. But a lot of this negativity also has to come from the baby boomer generation, which is a generation that is much older than us and much older than I think our parents would be. So it was kind of more our like grandparents is where this generation falls into play. But I think this has to do with the differences in society because, of course, the way they grew up is much different than how we're growing up now. But it doesn't necessarily need to be this way. We could start by changing this perspective by actually educating people on where these generations start and end, because a lot of the confusion does come from the fact that people don't know where millennials actually fall into place. Like, I thought my generation was millennial and my brother was a millennial and he's only 16, but I came to find out that we're actually Generation Z, which is not that much different because people do say negative things about Generation Z, but it's still, we're not millennials pretty much. And in addition to this, we could change this by setting examples and respecting each other, because giving respect first is something we should do. Because imagine if everyone thought the same way, where I'm not going to give you respect until you give me respect. If everyone thought that way, then no one would respect each other. It doesn't work that way. And we need to set the examples for the younger portion of our generation. So the little kids that are looking up to us, because regardless of their age, I should say, and I know a lot of you may have younger cousins or younger siblings or just any little kid in general, how some of them start to mimic what you're saying or they mimic what your actions, because I can see this in my 12-year-old cousin. I tend to see that when I'm talking to her and I'm making a statement, she tries to repeat what I'm saying or repeat my action or like copy my stance or something like that, because she looks up to me and sees me as her role model. The same thing with my brother. Our little cousin, who's only 10 years old, tends to mimic his personality and his actions because he looks up to him. And this is also to minimize this generation's sense of entitlement and their thinking, which goes back to children complaining about doing chores. And I know we all hate doing chores because we'd rather be doing whatever we want, and the same goes for younger kids as well. But doing chores is actually a great way to show responsibility and to gain independence, because research from the Center for Parenting Education shows that giving a child a set amount of chores actually allows them to develop higher self-esteem and responsibility and give them skills that they'll need later on in life to be independent, like right now, how we're all away from our parents and we're on our own basically. And these solutions may sound very far-fetched, I understand, and a lot of it may sound like I'm telling you guys what to do basically, but not everyone's going to adhere to this, obviously. Everyone is very different, and we can't control everyone. But we can start by just breaking this assumption that millennials are not all actually irresponsible or that we're all lazy. And starting that way, I think we could better the perception of our generation.
Alexis, how is this